What if two of history's most ruthless dictators had set aside their hatred and ruled together? Hitler and Stalin, opposites in ideology, but masters of power. If they had truly joined forces in World War II, the world order could have collapsed overnight. How different would history look if their pact endured? Stay with us. The answer may be darker than you imagine. A devil's bargain. When news broke in 1939 that Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact, governments across Europe were stunned into disbelief. The two most powerful dictators in Europe had long been sworn enemies, their ideologies locked in open hostility. Yet here they were, quietly dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. That shocking deal alone rattled the world. But what if it had gone further? What if they had not only agreed to stay out of each other's way, but decided to work hand in hand toward domination? The idea of fascists and communists cooperating sounds absurd at first glance, yet realpolitik often thrives where ideology falters. Hitler had no love for Marxism, branding it a conspiracy that threatened the Aryan future. Stalin despised fascism, condemning it as a mask for capitalist exploitation. Still, both men shared a single obsession: absolute power. Both understood that survival in the cutthroat climate of the 1930s demanded flexibility. The truth is that principle was always secondary to advantage. For Hitler, such a pact would buy precious time. His biggest fear was fighting a war on two fronts, the nightmare that had helped destroy Germany in the First World War. If Stalin could be kept cooperative, even if temporarily, Hitler could pour his full weight into subduing Britain and possibly extending German influence westward. For Stalin, cooperation meant breathing space. His purges of the Red Army had gutted its leadership, leaving him wary of immediate confrontation. With Hitler as a partner instead of a threat, the Soviet leader could rebuild, strengthen industry, and bide his time. The strength of such a bargain lay not in shared belief, but in resources and reach. Germany possessed a modernized, highly disciplined army, supported by an air force that had already demonstrated its effectiveness in Spain. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, controlled enormous reserves of oil, wheat, timber, and minerals. Together, they represented a union of German technology and Soviet resources, a pairing capable of overwhelming Europe before the Allies could organize an effective response. To the outside world, this alliance would have sent shockwaves. France and Britain had already been hesitant and divided in their response to German aggression. If Berlin and Moscow had presented a united front, it would have raised a grim question. How could two declining Western democracies resist a continental bloc stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific? The sheer scale of territory, manpower, and resources controlled by this partnership would have been enough to intimidate even the boldest of leaders. Yet the devil's bargain was not only about practical power. It would also have represented a staggering betrayal of rhetoric. Hitler had spent years telling Germans that Bolshevism was the enemy of civilization. Stalin had told his citizens that fascists were murderers to be resisted at all costs. Suddenly discarding these narratives would reveal something deeper. It would prove that ideologies could be reshaped overnight if the end goal demanded it. For millions of people who had swallowed propaganda without question, the sudden reversal would expose just how fragile truth had become in the hands of dictators. Behind closed doors, negotiations between Hitler and Stalin would have been tense, each man convinced he was the cleverer strategist. Stalin, always suspicious, would test every German proposal for hidden traps. Hitler, brimming with ambition, would promise grand spoils while quietly calculating when betrayal might be most convenient. Both men would smile at the table, sign documents and issue statements, while already plotting to destroy the very partner who had just handed him an advantage. This was not friendship. It was deception dressed up as cooperation. But could it have worked, at least for a while? Evidence suggests it could. Nazi propaganda was flexible enough to explain almost any move if it was framed as necessary for Germany's survival. Soviet citizens, long accustomed to abrupt shifts in party doctrine, would not have dared question Stalin's motives. Both regimes relied less on convincing the people than on silencing them. In such a system, what mattered was not popular acceptance but sheer enforcement. The potential consequences stretch far beyond Europe. An open Nazi-Soviet alliance would have altered every calculation in the world. Would smaller nations in Eastern Europe resist occupation if they knew there was no rival superpower willing to save them? Would neutral countries feel compelled to align with the bloc simply to avoid destruction? Even Japan, already pursuing imperial ambitions in Asia, might have reconsidered its own strategies if Berlin and Moscow stood firmly together. The notion of this partnership forces us to look beyond ideology and into the brutal mechanics of power. When survival and domination are the goals, almost any compromise becomes possible. What terrified Britain and France most was not the thought of two tyrants fighting, but the realization that they might actually cooperate. That prospect was more destabilizing than open conflict, because it left no obvious cracks for the Allies to exploit. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact gave a glimpse of this unholy union. But had Hitler and Stalin decided to deepen their cooperation rather than prepare for betrayal, the fate of Europe might have turned on a very different axis. It is chilling to consider that the continent's future may have rested not on the triumph of principle, but on the shifting calculations of two men willing to make deals with the devil, and willing to be the devil themselves. So if the pact had become a true alliance, how would Europe, already reeling from the shocks of the 1930s, have responded to the emergence of such a monstrous bloc? Stay with us to uncover the details. Europe before the storm. The 1930s were an age of disillusionment. Across Europe, the optimism that followed the First World War crumbled into bitterness and fear. Treaties meant to secure peace instead bred resentment, while economies collapsed and societies searched for salvation in new ideologies. This was the soil in which extremism flourished, and it was here that the possibility of an alliance between two unlikely powers began to take root. Germany's revival under Hitler did not occur in a vacuum. The humiliation of Versailles had left the nation humiliated and economically crippled. Then came the Wall Street crash of 1929, sending shockwaves across the globe. Millions of Germans lost their jobs and their savings. In that climate, promises of stability, discipline, and renewal sounded irresistible. When Hitler declared he would restore dignity and expand German living space, he was not speaking to fanatics alone, but to ordinary people desperate for certainty. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union presented a different but equally unsettling picture. Stalin's regime proclaimed itself the vanguard of progress, yet behind the rhetoric lay famine, purges, and forced industrialization. Entire classes of people, kulaks, dissidents, suspected traitors, were uprooted and destroyed. At the same time, the Soviet Union's 5-year plans turned the country into an industrial power faster than almost anyone thought possible. The contrast was stark. Terror on the one hand, transformation on the other. What made the 1930s especially volatile was not only the rise of fascism and communism, but the collapse of faith in liberal democracy. Many nations watched as their parliaments bickered, their economies stagnated, and their elites appeared powerless. Capitalism itself seemed discredited in the wake of the Great Depression. Voters across Europe began to see democracy not as a shield against tyranny, but as a system unable to deliver. Radical alternatives, however brutal, gained credibility by promising decisive action. By 1930, both the Nazis and communists in Germany were riding this wave of discontent. Together, they commanded nearly 40% of Reichstag seats, a remarkable indication of how far the political center had eroded. To ordinary Germans, choosing between the two extremes seemed more appealing than clinging to parties that had presided over chaos. Though rivals, these movements thrived on the same sense of collapse and the same promise of rebirth. Beyond Germany, Europe itself was a continent of competing insecurities. Italy under Mussolini was already entrenched in fascist rule, eyeing Mediterranean expansion. France, still scarred by the First World War, built massive defensive fortifications like the Maginot Line, signaling its fear of another German strike. Britain, though still a global empire, was weary of war and hesitant to commit fully to continental struggles. Smaller nations in Eastern Europe, from Poland to the Baltics, found themselves caught between the gravitational pull of two giants, Berlin and Moscow. This fragile balance created opportunities for manipulation. Hitler and Stalin were not merely watching events unfold, they were calculating how to exploit them. Each leader saw the failures of the West as proof that liberal democracies would always hesitate, always falter, always argue among themselves. This perception emboldened both men, convincing them that bold, aggressive moves would succeed precisely because their rivals were too cautious to stop them. In this environment, the seeds of cooperation between Hitler and Stalin could germinate. Their worldviews were fundamentally opposed, but their reading of the international stage was strikingly similar. Both concluded that politics was a struggle for survival, that weakness invited attack, and that morality was nothing more than a mask for power. Realpolitik was not an abstract theory for them, but the guiding principle of their regimes. Consider the symbolism of the time. Hitler spoke of Lebensraum, the need to expand German living space by seizing lands in the east. Stalin spoke of safeguarding socialism by expanding the Soviet sphere of influence. Both visions required dismantling the existing order and redrawing borders. Both justified aggression as a matter of destiny. With such overlapping ambitions, confrontation was inevitable, but temporary alignment against common obstacles was not unthinkable. The true irony of this period is that while most of the world viewed fascism and communism as mortal enemies, the systems themselves had more in common than either side cared to admit. Both demanded total obedience. Both relied on secret police, mass arrests, and censorship. Both celebrated the cult of a single leader whose portrait hung everywhere and whose word became law. To the average citizen, whether one lived under the swastika or the hammer and sickle, daily life meant submission to a government that tolerated no dissent. These parallels laid the groundwork for cooperation when circumstances demanded it. If Hitler and Stalin were forced to choose between fighting each other or temporarily combining strength, history suggests they were ruthless enough to choose the latter. The seeds of that choice lay in the chaos of the 1930s, a decade when the promise of order, however cruel, seemed more appealing than the uncertainty of freedom. The world, distracted and divided, failed to grasp just how dangerous this convergence could be. Leaders in London, Paris, and Washington believed ideology would keep fascists and communists apart. They underestimated the cold logic of survival. That miscalculation would prove costly when the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shattered illusions in 1939. Yet the pact was only the beginning. The true nightmare would not be a temporary non-aggression agreement, but a full alliance forged in the fires of fear and ambition. And the continent already showed signs of what could happen when predators found common ground. If Europe was already a tinderbox, what would happen once the first match was struck and Poland became the victim of two advancing armies? Come with us to find out more. When two predators feast. At dawn in September 1939, Poland became the unlucky stage where two predators closed in from opposite sides. German tanks rumbled across the western border, while just weeks later, Soviet troops advanced from the east. The world watched in disbelief as two sworn enemies who had spent years denouncing one another acted in chilling coordination. For Poland, the invasion was not just a military defeat, but the beginning of a national tragedy unlike anything the country had endured before. Germany's assault was swift and ruthless. Blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed Polish defenses in a matter of days, combining armored divisions, airstrikes, and rapid troop movements into a single devastating strategy. Cities crumbled under Luftwaffe bombardments, railways were torn apart, and terrified civilians streamed eastward in search of safety. But safety was an illusion. On September 17th, Stalin's Red Army crossed the border, sealing Poland's fate. What had once been a sovereign nation was about to be carved apart like spoils of war. The secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had already determined Poland's fate before the first shot was fired. Berlin and Moscow agreed to partition the country, each side taking a portion that suited its ambitions. For Hitler, the western half brought him closer to Lebensraum. For Stalin, the Eastern Territories meant securing a buffer zone and absorbing lands that had long been contested. It was conquest by agreement, a cold calculation in which Poland's sovereignty simply did not matter. The brutality that followed demonstrated just how far the alliance could go in practice. In the German zone, the Nazi regime unleashed a campaign of terror designed to erase Polish identity. Intellectuals, priests, and community leaders were rounded up and executed. Millions of ordinary Poles were stripped of property and deported as slave laborers to Germany. The Jewish population faced an even grimmer fate, herded into ghettos and eventually targeted for extermination in death camps. On the Soviet side, a different but equally horrifying program unfolded. Stalin's NKVD secret police orchestrated mass arrests and deportations. Families were torn apart as hundreds of thousands were sent to Siberia or Central Asia. The Katyn massacre, in which approximately 22,000 Polish officers and intelligentsia were executed, symbolized the Soviet method: eliminate potential resistance by killing those most capable of organizing it. Stalin's aim was not only to control territory, but to extinguish the possibility of a future independent Poland. What made the invasion of Poland so shocking was the way two regimes, supposedly irreconcilable enemies, could cooperate with such precision. Even the transfer of prisoners revealed the grim reality of the arrangement. German communists who had fled to the Soviet Union during the 1930s purges were handed back to the Gestapo. Some Poles captured by Stalin were passed into German custody, where they moved from gulags to concentration camps. It was not partnership in name alone, but a machinery of coordination that extended to human lives. The international reaction was swift but fractured. Britain and France declared war on Germany after the invasion began, yet they did little to intervene on Poland's behalf. Their armies remained largely idle, bound by fear of escalation and unprepared for the speed of German advances. Stalin's invasion on the Eastern Front added another layer of paralysis. To openly confront the Soviet Union as well as Germany seemed impossible. Poland was left to fight alone, its pleas for help lost amid diplomatic hesitation. For the Polish people, the consequences were catastrophic. Roughly 6 million citizens would die during the war, nearly 1/5 of the entire pre-war population. The invasion marked the beginning of that nightmare. Families who had lived on the same land for generations suddenly found themselves under two different tyrannies. Villages burned, children were forced into labor, and entire communities vanished overnight. Poland's resistance movements would later become some of the bravest in Europe, but in 1939 the country was crushed by a coordinated onslaught it could never have withstood alone. The partition of Poland also provided a disturbing model for what might have followed elsewhere had the Nazi-Soviet partnership endured. By erasing Poland in a matter of weeks, Hitler and Stalin demonstrated that small nations could be swallowed whole if larger powers agreed on how to split the carcass. It was not just conquest, but an experiment in how far collaboration could extend. For Hitler, the occupation proved that his vision of expansion could be realized without immediate Soviet interference. For Stalin, the conquest reinforced his belief that he could expand his influence westward without facing German hostility, at least temporarily. Both dictators extracted what they wanted, while ordinary Poles paid the price in blood and suffering. The dismemberment of Poland was not just a tragedy for one nation, but a warning to the rest of Europe. It revealed that ideological hatred could be shelved in favor of territorial greed. It showed that the two most brutal regimes of the era were fully capable of synchronizing their methods when it suited them. And it left the world wondering how many more countries might meet the same fate if such cooperation continued. Poland became the testing ground for collaboration between fascism and communism. The results were chilling: deportations, massacres, and cultural annihilation. If this was what happened when two predators feasted together, what horrors awaited if they decided to expand their cooperation across the continent? Would Britain be next in their sights, standing alone across the Channel against a united front of tyranny? Stay here as we reveal everything. Britain between two monsters. Winston Churchill often warned that the world should never forget the nature of the Bolsheviks. Crocodiles, he called them, creatures that could never be trusted, always waiting for the chance to strike. His contempt for Stalin was well known long before the Soviet Union became Britain's reluctant ally. Yet in the late 1930s and early 1940s, Churchill faced the grim prospect that his country might soon stand alone between two devouring predators, Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia. Britain entered the Second World War with mixed confidence. It was still an empire stretching across continents, its navy the largest in the world. Yet beneath this global reach lay deep vulnerabilities. The scars of the First World War lingered in both politics and society. Many Britons were weary of new entanglements, and leaders had invested heavily in appeasement, hoping that concessions might satisfy Hitler's appetite. Churchill, often dismissed as a warmonger in the 1930s, suddenly found his warnings justified when Poland was erased from the map. The German war machine loomed as the greatest threat, but the possibility of a German-Soviet partnership multiplied Britain's fears. If the two dictatorships held together, Hitler could direct his energies westward without fear of being stabbed in the back. Stalin, meanwhile, would gain time to consolidate his hold on Eastern Europe. From Churchill's perspective, Britain was at risk of being cornered. He knew his country could not endure a continental bloc stretching from the Atlantic coastlines to the steppes of Russia. The invasion plan that haunted British strategists was Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's blueprint for a cross-channel assault. The British Isles, shielded for centuries by the English Channel, suddenly seemed less impregnable in the face of German air superiority. The Battle of Britain in 1940 demonstrated just how close the danger was. Luftwaffe bombers pounded London and other major cities, seeking to cripple morale and destroy the Royal Air Force. Had Hitler concentrated more relentlessly on airfields rather than switching to city bombing, the skies over Britain might have fallen. Behind the immediate fear of invasion lay a broader question. How would Britain resist if both Germany and the Soviet Union worked in tandem? Churchill's crocodile analogy came from his belief that Stalin was every bit as untrustworthy as Hitler. He recognized that Stalin's regime might feed Germany with vital resources like oil, grain, and rubber if it served Moscow's interests. In fact, German-Soviet trade agreements in the early 1940s already showed how dangerous that cooperation could be. If the partnership deepened, Britain would face not one enemy, but two supplying each other's needs. The political climate inside Britain further complicated the picture. The country was not united in its determination to resist. Figures like Sir Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists, openly admired aspects of Hitler's Germany. Though the fascist movement never commanded the same numbers as its continental counterparts, the existence of tens of thousands of sympathizers presented the chilling possibility of collaboration if an invasion succeeded. Hitler's infamous Black Book of people to be arrested upon occupation included intellectuals, politicians, and cultural figures who might lead resistance. The thought of a puppet regime installed in London was not a fantasy, but a real danger. Churchill's role in these years was not only to rally his nation, but to keep the United States watching closely. He knew that Britain could not withstand a prolonged assault without American support. His speeches were crafted not just for the British public, but also for listeners across the Atlantic. He spoke of a common struggle, portraying the battle as one for civilization itself. Yet behind the rhetoric lay desperation. Britain was burning cities and burying civilians, and Churchill was acutely aware that his nation could not stand forever without allies. The Soviet factor only made matters worse. Churchill found himself in a paradox. He despised Stalin's regime, yet recognized that Soviet opposition to Hitler was Britain's best chance of survival. This tension defined much of his wartime leadership. He was forced to speak words of praise about the Red Army, even while privately distrusting the man who commanded it. The crocodile metaphor captured that unease. Cooperation with Stalin might be necessary, but it was never safe. Had Hitler and Stalin deepened their alliance instead of turning on each other, Churchill's Britain would have faced the gravest challenge in its history. An invasion by Germany alone was perilous enough, but an invasion backed by Soviet resources and tacit support would have been nearly impossible to resist. Britain's defences were strong but limited. Its army was far smaller than Germany's, its economy strained by war, and its colonies already restive. Survival would have hinged entirely on breaking the unity of its enemies or drawing America fully into the conflict. For ordinary Britons, life in those early war years was a mixture of resilience and dread. Families carried gas masks, children were evacuated from cities, and blackout curtains became a nightly ritual. Air raid sirens wailed with terrifying regularity. Every bomb dropped by the Luftwaffe reinforced the sense that Britain was balancing on a knife's edge. The thought of a combined German-Soviet assault would have been unbearable, for it meant there would be no reprieve, no hope of Stalin turning against Hitler, no chance of playing one dictator against the other. The irony is that Churchill, who distrusted Stalin most of all, later raised toasts in his honor when the Soviets became allies after 1941. That pivot revealed how desperate Britain was to survive. But in a reality where Hitler and Stalin remained bound by their pact, Churchill might never have had the chance to make that shift. Britain would have stood isolated, battered, and vulnerable to a conquest that could have rewritten the future of democracy itself. As bombs fell and invasion loomed, one question hung heavy in the air. If America stayed hesitant and Stalin stayed friendly with Hitler, how long could Britain remain the last bulwark against tyranny? Stay with us to know. America on the fence. Across the Atlantic, while Europe was being carved apart, the United States stood at a crossroads. The horrors unfolding overseas were undeniable, yet a vast portion of the American public wanted no part in another European war. Memories of the First World War were still raw, with families recalling the staggering loss of life and the uneasy feeling that their sacrifices had not brought lasting peace. This legacy of bitterness shaped US policy in the late 1930s and early 1940s, leaving the nation hesitant, divided, and firmly on the fence. Isolationism was not a fringe view, it was mainstream. Opinion polls consistently showed that most Americans opposed sending troops to Europe. Even after the invasion of Poland, only a small minority, around 16%, believed the US should intervene militarily to support Britain and France. The country's instinct was to focus inward, to repair its own economy, and to avoid entanglement in what many saw as Europe's endless quarrels. This attitude was not only about war weariness, there was also resentment toward the old colonial powers. Franklin D. Roosevelt himself frequently criticized Britain's imperial practices, and his son Elliott Roosevelt voiced what many Americans felt when he accused Britain and France of exploiting the global financial system for their own advantage. The belief was that Europe's empires had dragged the world into conflict before and might do so again. Why then should America spill blood to save them? Yet neutrality did not mean indifference to opportunity. American industry thrived on the prospect of selling arms and supplies without committing troops. The US economy, still recovering from the Depression, found new life in the production of planes, ships, and munitions for those willing to pay. Cash and carry policies allowed Britain and France to purchase desperately needed war material as long as they transported it themselves. It was business first, war later. At the same time, powerful voices argued passionately against involvement. Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous aviator, became the face of the non-interventionist movement. Through the America First Committee, he spoke to enormous crowds, insisting that the US should stay clear of foreign wars. He admired certain aspects of Nazi Germany, had received the German Eagle Medal from Hitler's regime, and warned that intervention would only weaken America. His speeches mixed patriotism with a chilling undercurrent of sympathy for authoritarian strength. The German-American Bund, a fascist-leaning organization within the US, added another layer of complexity. With rallies that drew tens of thousands, its members waved swastikas alongside American flags, claiming that cooperation with Germany made more sense than fighting it. Their rhetoric was openly anti-Semitic, echoing themes straight out of Nazi propaganda. While they never gained political dominance, Their presence revealed that admiration for Hitler's regime existed even on American soil. Industrial titans also played their part. Henry Ford, the automobile magnate, had long been a controversial figure for his writings that blamed Jews for the world's ills. His book, The International Jew, was widely read in Germany and admired by Hitler himself, who once called Ford a single great man. While Ford did not dictate foreign policy, his influence on American society and his connections with Europe made him an unsettling figure in the debate over war. Behind the scenes, Roosevelt navigated these turbulent waters carefully. He recognized the growing danger in Europe, but could not ignore the strength of isolationist sentiment at home. Instead of pushing for immediate military action, he worked incrementally, expanding naval patrols, arranging secret meetings with Churchill, and laying the groundwork for eventual support. His skill was in moving the country step by step toward engagement, even while publicly assuring voters that America would stay at peace. Still, the turning point had not yet come. Through 1940 and 1941, many Americans continued to believe that the oceans provided a natural shield, that Hitler's ambitions were limited to Europe, and that Stalin's empire posed no direct threat to the Western Hemisphere. Some even argued that a German-dominated Europe could be a valuable trading partner, as long as the US kept its distance. Make money, not war, became an unspoken motto for those who saw profit in neutrality. But cracks were beginning to show. Reports of atrocities, though often dismissed as propaganda, trickled across the Atlantic. Britain's desperate need for aid highlighted the limits of isolation. And looming in the background was the dawning awareness that science was on the cusp of delivering a weapon unlike anything seen before. If Germany or the Soviet Union gained access to nuclear technology, neutrality might no longer be an option. For the moment, though, the US remained suspended between two impulses: the desire to remain safe within its borders and the growing realization that a world dominated by dictators could not be ignored forever. Industry roared, politicians argued, and citizens debated in town halls and over radios. But the decision of when or whether to intervene still hung in the balance. The world wondered, would the US remain the cautious bystander, or would it awaken only when the balance of power tipped too far to ignore? Stay with us to know what really happened. The bomb that could change everything. In the early 1940s, whispers of a weapon with unimaginable power drifted through the scientific communities of Europe and America. Physicists spoke of splitting the atom, of unleashing energy vast enough to destroy entire cities in an instant. For politicians and generals, these discussions were no longer abstract. The discovery of nuclear fission in 1938 had opened a door, and whoever walked through it first could hold the fate of the world in their hands. In a timeline where Hitler and Stalin cooperated rather than clashed, the race for the bomb would have taken a chilling turn. At the heart of this race was a group of exiled scientists. Many of them were German Jews who fled Hitler's persecution, carrying with them knowledge of cutting-edge physics. In Britain, minds like Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls worked on calculating the critical mass needed for a chain reaction, a breakthrough that proved such a device was not only possible, but feasible within a few years. Their memorandum in 1940 became the foundation of the British Tube Alloys project, the world's first serious nuclear weapons program. If Britain had fallen to a Nazi-Soviet juggernaut, its scientists and research might have been seized by Hitler. Stalin, ever pragmatic, would not have objected if the spoils of conquest included laboratories and brilliant physicists. Together, Berlin and Moscow could have leapfrogged America's slow progress and taken the lead in the nuclear race. The thought of both regimes sharing such a weapon is chilling. The capacity to obliterate London, Paris, or even Washington with a single bomb. The Americans at this point were still playing catch-up. The Manhattan Project only began to gather momentum after the Einstein-Szilard letter warned Roosevelt of German advances. In reality, Germany's program was poorly organized and undermined by its leadership's disdain for Jewish physics. But in a world where Hitler and Stalin pooled resources, the story could have been different. Stalin, though behind technologically, was ruthless in extracting information from scientists and spies. Hitler, with access to captured European researchers, could have supplied both manpower and equipment. Access to raw materials would have been another advantage. Uranium in Czechoslovakia and Belgian Congo was essential for nuclear development. If Germany controlled these deposits and shared them with the Soviets, research could have advanced rapidly. Soviet industry, already skilled at mass production, could have provided the infrastructure no single nation could match. If Hitler and Stalin had tested a bomb first, the balance of power would have shifted overnight. Britain might have capitulated under nuclear threat. France, having fallen early, would have seen puppet governments restored with even less resistance. Smaller nations would have had no choice but to submit, knowing defiance could reduce their cities to ash. Would the dictators have shared control, or would one seek to monopolize it? Stalin thrived on secrecy, while Hitler demanded total dominance. Any sharing could only have lasted briefly before paranoia set in. The question is not if betrayal would occur, but when. For the United States, the stakes would have been existential. Washington would have faced the terrifying prospect of an enemy bloc not only dominating Europe, but also wielding the ultimate weapon. US intelligence already suspected Germany of advancing rapidly on nuclear research. In this alternate world, the suspicion would have been justified. American policymakers would have had to accelerate their efforts, pouring resources into the Manhattan Project at an even faster rate. In this scenario, the first mushroom cloud might not have risen over Hiroshima, but over London or New York. Both regimes had already shown utter disregard for human life. With nuclear weapons in their hands, the bomb would not have been a last resort, but a tool of terror, an extension of the policies they already practiced with bullets and camps. The nuclear race here would not be science competing with science. It would be survival itself. Whichever side struck first would dictate the terms of global order. The 20th century might not have been defined by a Cold War, but by a short, fiery age of nuclear domination under a pact of tyrants. If nuclear weapons reshaped our world even under the strained balance of real history, how different would history look if the first atomic monopoly belonged not to America, but to Hitler and Stalin together? Let us tell you. The domino of empire. While Europe was being torn apart by German panzers and Soviet tanks, the East was already ablaze. Japan's imperial armies had been on the march since the 1930s, swallowing Manchuria, invading China, and threatening the balance of power across the Pacific. In this altered world where Hitler and Stalin stood together, the fate of Asia would have been shaped not only by Japanese ambitions, but also by how the two dictators cast their shadow over the colonies and empires beyond Europe. The first domino to wobble was China. By the late 1930s, China was already reeling from Japan's brutal war of conquest. The infamous Nanjing Massacre of 1937, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were slaughtered, revealed the scale of Japanese brutality. Yet China, under Chiang Kai-shek, held on with stubborn resistance. If Germany and the Soviet Union had cemented their alliance, China's lifeline might have been severed. Stalin had provided supplies and training to Mao Zedong's communists, but in a world where Moscow stood firmly beside Berlin, that aid could have been withdrawn, leaving China dangerously exposed. The European colonial empires in Asia, Britain in India and Burma, France in Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia, were already vulnerable. These territories supplied raw materials critical for war: rubber, oil, rice and tin. Japan coveted them all. If Britain's homeland faced the combined threat of Nazi Germany and Soviet support, its Asian possessions would have been stretched thin. With the Royal Navy tied down in Europe, defending faraway colonies would have been nearly impossible. Consider the Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia. It was one of the richest oil-producing regions in the world, a prize Japan desperately needed to fuel its navy and air force. In reality, Japan seized it in 1942 after cutting through weakened colonial defenses. In this alternate history, with Britain and the Netherlands preoccupied by a Nazi-Soviet behemoth in Europe, Japan's path to Indonesia would have been even easier. The same logic applies to Burma and Malaya, whose plantations and ports became irresistible targets. India presented another layer of complexity. The subcontinent was Britain's crown jewel, providing manpower and resources to the empire. But nationalist movements were rising, with Gandhi pushing non-violent resistance and Subhas Chandra Bose seeking foreign backing. Bose later aligned with Axis powers. In a world where Britain looked doomed by the Hitler-Stalin pact, Indian nationalists might have found stronger encouragement to push for liberation. A collapse of Britain's Asian authority would have set off a chain reaction across the region. Japan's role would also have shifted. Historically, Tokyo clashed with the Soviets in battles like Khalkhin Gol. A solid Nazi-Soviet partnership would have forced Japan to abandon its northern ambitions and focus entirely on southern expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. With Europe in enemy hands, Japan's thrust southward could have been even more aggressive. This shift would have reshaped American strategy. The US had long watched Japan with suspicion. An Axis bloc stretching from Europe into Asia would have heightened those fears dramatically. The Pacific, once seen as America's defensive frontier, could have become the next great battleground. Pearl Harbor might not have been a single shocking attack, but the start of a broader campaign, with Hitler and Stalin observing from afar. The ripple effects would not have stopped in Asia. In the Middle East, rich in oil and strategically located, Persia and Iraq would have been prime targets. The Soviets coveted Persia, while Germany sought oil. Together, they might have pushed Britain out of the region, denying the Allies vital fuel while extending their reach toward India. Even Africa would not have been immune. Colonial troops drawn from across the continent had fought bravely in earlier wars. If Britain and France were overwhelmed at home and colonies destabilized abroad, independence movements in Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya might have accelerated. A weakened colonial grip would have left vast swaths of Africa open to exploitation by whichever power prevailed. The most striking aspect of this domino effect is how quickly conflict could have shifted from Europe to global reordering. Japan would exploit the vacuum in Asia, nationalist movements would surge, and America would be forced to choose between passivity or a conflict that now spanned every ocean. The dominoes were fragile, and once the first fell, the rest could not be stopped. China weakened, Southeast Asia seized, India destabilized, the Pacific threatened, the cascade would have been unstoppable. A war that began with tanks rolling into Poland might have ended with empires collapsing and continents realigning under tyranny's weight. If dictators ruled Europe, would Asia have collapsed faster, and could America have stood aside? Stay with us to find out. The shadow of a different Cold War. By the mid-1940s, the question was no longer who would win the war, but who would dominate the peace. In our real timeline, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two global superpowers. Yet if Hitler and Stalin had preserved their pact, the post-war world might have faced a very different Cold War one, where the balance of terror looked nothing like we know. The first key to this altered outcome lies in resources. Germany's industrial power, strengthened by conquests in France, the Low Countries, and possibly Britain, would have surged to unprecedented levels. Stalin, meanwhile, controlled vast reserves of oil, coal, grain, and iron. Combined, the two dictatorships could have formed an economic bloc capable of outproducing nearly any rival. But raw materials were only part of the picture. Hitler proved how easily puppet regimes could be installed in occupied lands, while Stalin excelled at molding satellite states through purges and secret police. In an enduring alliance, Europe might have been carved into Nazi and Soviet zones of domination, with nations reduced to pieces on a chessboard. For the United States, the consequences would have been staggering. America's rise to power was fueled by its role as the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies while building its own military might. If Europe had fallen to a Nazi-Soviet bloc before US mobilization, Washington would have confronted an entire continent united under tyranny. The Manhattan Project might still have produced the atomic bomb, but instead of using it in Japan, America would have faced the prospect of nuclear confrontation with a Eurasian fortress. This alternate Cold War would not have been defined by capitalism versus communism, but by hemispheres locked in survival. Hitler sought to export fascism. Stalin aimed to spread collectivism. Yet in practice, their systems of repression, censorship, surveillance, and purges were so similar that occupied peoples might have seen little difference. Who would dominate such an alliance? Hitler's recklessness gave him short-term momentum, but Stalin's patience and talent for rebuilding could have shifted power later. History suggests betrayal was inevitable, yet before that fracture, the dictators might have reshaped the world so completely that the Cold War would bear no resemblance to the one we recall. Fault lines would also shift. Instead of Berlin or Korea, the decisive fronts might have been Havana, Buenos Aires, or Mexico City, as both sides sought influence across the Americas. Scientific advances would have accelerated as well. A joint Nazi-Soviet program could have vaulted past the US in nuclear research, rocketry, and even space exploration, leaving Washington scrambling to catch up. For the rest of the world, the consequences would have been suffocating. Nations in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East would not have been courted by competing powers, but coerced into obedience by a bloc with no rivals. The promise of independence or balanced diplomacy would have evaporated. The superpower contest in this alternate Cold War would not have been measured in cautious standoffs, but in the looming threat of annihilation. With no ideological cracks to exploit, America would have faced an enemy whose combined strength dwarfed anything seen before. The shadow of such a Cold War would have been darker, shorter, and deadlier. What if two ruthless dictators had shaped the post-war world? Could anyone have survived that Cold War? Come along as we uncover the hidden story. The price of power. History often turns on choices made in backrooms and whispered in corridors. The pact between Hitler and Stalin in 1939 was one such choice, shocking the world by proving that ideology could be cast aside when power demanded it. But what if the pact had endured, deepening into genuine cooperation? The cost of that decision, measured not just in battlefields but in human futures, reveals a haunting lesson about the fragile balance of global order. The greatest price of such an alliance would not have been territorial alone. It would have been psychological. The collapse of certainty that fascism and communism were destined to destroy each other would have left the rest of the world adrift. For Britain, France, and the United States, the idea of playing one dictatorship against the other had been a cornerstone of strategy. If both stood together, those nations would have faced the realization that their assumptions were meaningless. In politics, hope built on false certainties is as dangerous as defeat itself. For the occupied nations, the cost would have been cultural erasure on an industrial scale. Language, history, and identity would have been systematically dismantled, replaced by narratives approved in Berlin and Moscow. Poland gave a glimpse of this in reality, but under a deeper pact, entire regions might have vanished not only from maps, but from memory. When two powers agree to divide the world, the first casualties are always the stories of the conquered. The price of power would also have been counted in resistance crushed. Underground networks, partisan fighters, and exiled governments would have found themselves squeezed between two tyrannies with little hope of foreign rescue. Where, in our real history, resistance movements could look to either the West or the Soviets for aid, in this alternate world they would have faced isolation. Defiance would still have existed, human dignity ensures it, but its chances of survival would have been far slimmer. Perhaps the most lasting cost would have been the reshaping of morality itself. If Hitler and Stalin had proven that even their bitter ideologies could be suspended in the pursuit of conquest, the message to future generations would have been corrosive. It would suggest that values are disposable, that conviction is nothing more than camouflage for ambition, and that the world belongs only to the ruthless. In such a world, the idea of principled alliances might have been replaced forever by a grim acceptance that all politics is betrayal waiting to happen. This is the ultimate lesson of the nightmare that almost was. Power without limits corrodes not only nations, but the very fabric of trust between them. The possibility that two of history's most brutal regimes could have ruled together shows how fragile the boundary is between rivalry and collusion. If Hitler and Stalin had remained allies, which outcome do you think would have been the most terrifying? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.